There exists a photograph, faded by time, of a child smiling. But the smile is a fragile mask. It doesn't reach the eyes. In those eyes, there is a quiet knowledge, an awareness far beyond their years, a silent testament to a world unseen by the rest of us. This image is not just a forgotten memory from a family album. It is a doctrine made visible, a philosophy captured on film. It represents the chilling success of a faith that taught its followers that to truly love God, they must first erase the most sacred boundaries of the self, of the body, and most disturbingly, of childhood itself. For half a century, behind the closed doors of communes scattered across the globe like forgotten seeds, a different kind of gospel was preached. It was a gospel of absolute surrender, written by a single man who crowned himself a prophet, a direct line to the divine. His words, delivered through thousands of letters and crackling cassette tapes, became the new scripture, replacing ancient texts with a radical, dangerous, and seductive ideology. This is the story of the Family International, a movement that began with promises of a spiritual utopia born from the counterculture dream of the 1960s and descended into a meticulously structured, generational nightmare. It is a story of how belief, in its most potent form, can be twisted into a weapon, and how the search for paradise can pave the road to an inescapable psychological hell. They called the outside world the system, a place of materialism, hypocrisy, and spiritual decay. In its place, they offered a revolution for Jesus, a life of total commitment, community, and unconditional love. But within this self-proclaimed sanctuary, a new system was being forged, one far more invasive and controlling than the one they had fled. It was a system of constant surveillance, of mandatory confession, where every private thought was a potential sin to be exposed, and every doubt a betrayal of God's chosen messenger. The promise of freedom became the architecture of a prison without walls, where the bars were made of faith, guilt, and the terror of being cast out alone into the wicked world. This is not merely a historical account of a cult's rise and fall. It is an examination of the mechanics of manipulation, a deep dive into how the profound human need for belonging and meaning can be hijacked to justify the unthinkable. It is the story of how innocence was systematically dismantled and reframed as a barrier to spiritual enlightenment, and how generations of children were raised to believe that their bodies were not their own, but instruments for a divine purpose they were too young to comprehend. We will journey into the heart of this secluded world to understand not only what happened, but how it was allowed to happen for so long, hidden in plain sight. This is the story of the children in the photographs, whose smiles hid a universe of secrets, and their long, arduous journey to reclaim their own voice after a lifetime of being told what to believe, what to feel, and who to be. To understand the roots of this secluded world, we must first step back into the fractured landscape of late 1960s America. It was an era of seismic cultural shifts, a time when the ground beneath an entire generation seemed to be cracking open, revealing a deep chasm between the past and a terrifying, uncertain future. The air was thick with the smoke of protest and the echoes of a distant, unpopular war in Vietnam that played out on television screens each night, bringing the brutality of conflict into the nation's living rooms. The polished veneer of the American dream had begun to tarnish, revealing a society rife with hypocrisy and inequality. Traditional pillars of society, the family, the church, the government, were no longer seen as sources of stability, but as the architects of a corrupt and soulless system. For countless young people, this was a moment of profound alienation. They felt like strangers in their own homes, disconnected from the values of their parents' generation. In response, they spilled into the streets and onto the open road, a mass exodus from the suburbs and quiet towns, all searching for an alternative truth, for something real in a world that felt profoundly artificial. Out of this societal crucible, a new spiritual fervor was born, the Jesus movement. It was a strange and potent hybrid, blending the long hair, communal living, and anti-establishment ethos of the hippies with the evangelical zeal of a great awakening. Communes and coffee houses became the new cathedrals, and acoustic guitars the new church organs. Theirs was a raw, emotional faith, a stark contrast to the rigid, formal religion of their elders. It was a search for a Jesus who was not a distant icon in a stained glass window, but a fellow revolutionary, a brother who understood their rejection of materialism and war. It was here, in this fertile ground of spiritual seeking, that a man named David Berg saw his opportunity. A former preacher with a history of failed ministries and a growing disillusionment with the established church, Berg possessed a keen, almost predatory understanding of the anxieties and desires of this lost generation. He spoke their language of revolution, but offered it with the certainty of divine mandate. He didn't offer a gentle, passive faith. He offered a mission, an urgent calling for the end times. The first followers, known then as the children of God, were not just believers, they were soldiers in a spiritual war. They were called to abandon everything, their families, their educations, their possessions, and their pasts. This act of severing ties was the first crucial test of loyalty. In exchange, they were given a new family, a powerful identity, and a profound sense of purpose. They were the chosen few, the pioneers of God's new kingdom on a dying planet. For a young person adrift in a sea of uncertainty, the appeal was magnetic. It was a promise of belonging, of radical authenticity, of being part of something larger than oneself. But this is just the first layer of the story, because the family they were joining was built on a foundation that was already beginning to warp under the weight of its founder's absolute authority. And the revolution they signed up for would soon demand a price far greater and far more insidious than they could ever have imagined. In the beginning, life in the communes was a potent cocktail of revolutionary fervor and communal devotion. In crowded houses from London to Los Angeles, the air was thick with the scent of incense, cheap food, and youthful idealism. Days were a blur of street preaching, shared chores, and fervent, hours-long worship sessions where music and prayer melted into a single ecstatic wave. Stripped of their former identities, members adopted new biblical names, sharing everything from food to clothing, their lives woven together into a single, vibrant tapestry of shared belief. They saw themselves as a new tribe, a living ark adrift on the corrupt sea of modern society, which they called the system. But this ark had a single, unseen captain. David Berg, who now called himself Moses David, or simply Mo, began to strategically withdraw from daily life. His physical absence was a calculated move, transforming him from a mere man into a mythic, oracle-like figure. They saw themselves as a new tribe, a living ark adrift on the corrupt sea of modern society, which they called the system. But this ark had a single, unseen captain. David Berg, who now called himself Moses David, or simply Mo, began to strategically withdraw from daily life. His physical absence was a calculated move, transforming him from a mere man into a mythic, oracle-like figure. His voice was no longer heard in person, but through a torrent of writings that would become the group's sacred texts, the Mo letters. These were not mere newsletters. They were treated as direct, infallible revelations from God, channeled through his chosen prophet. Delivered to communes scattered across the globe, their arrival was an event. A hush would fall as the pages, often illustrated with Berg's own crude and provocative cartoons, were read aloud with the gravity of Scripture. They were studied, memorized, and debated, their words becoming the very architecture of the followers' new reality. Through them, Berg dismantled their connection to the outside world piece by piece. Families of origin were labeled systemites, agents of a world that sought to poison their newfound purity. Universities, governments, and traditional churches were all part of a satanic conspiracy. The letters created a closed loop of logic, an ideological fortress where Berg's voice was the only one that echoed. He redefined love as absolute obedience and faith as the complete suspension of critical thought. Doubts were not questions to be explored, but spiritual diseases to be purged through public confession and prayer. This constant stream of doctrine was a masterclass in psychological conditioning, creating an environment of intense peer pressure and mutual surveillance. Everyone was watching everyone else, ensuring the prophet's words were the only law. He was the father, the prophet, the provider of all meaning. His followers, now thousands strong, were his children, entirely dependent on him for their spiritual survival. They were being forged into instruments of his will, convinced that their total submission was an act of ultimate devotion to God. They had no idea that the very definition of that devotion was about to be twisted into a horrifying new shape, one that would shatter the last vestiges of the world they once knew and demand a sacrifice of their very souls. That horrifying new shape arrived in 1974, delivered through the familiar medium of the Mo letters. It was a doctrine that would become the group's most infamous and defining characteristic, a concept so radical it would shatter the final barrier between the children of God and the outside world. Berg called it flirty fishing. The revelation was presented not as a suggestion, but as a divine command, read aloud in hushed communes from California to London. Imagine the scene. Followers gathered on worn carpets, the air thick with anticipation, as a leader's voice gave life to the cold ink on the page. Female disciples were now instructed to use their sexuality as a tool for evangelism. They were to go out into the cities, into the neon-lit nights of bars and lonely streets, and use their physical appeal to attract men, win their hearts, and ultimately lead them to God and the family. Sex, once a private act shrouded in the language of marital purity, was now reframed as the ultimate form of ministry, a holy sacrifice for the salvation of mankind. A shockwave of silent disbelief rippled through the communes. This was a profound and terrifying escalation. For years, they had been taught to be a people set apart, to guard their bodies as temples, to be pure and separate from the carnal sins of the system. Now, their prophet was commanding them to immerse themselves in it, to use the very act they had been taught to view with caution as a sacred weapon. Berg, ever the master manipulator, had anticipated this resistance. He cloaked the directive in twisted scripture, portraying these women as modern-day Esthers or Rahabs, heroines using their bodies to save souls from an impending apocalypse. He coined the term God's hookers, a shocking label designed to be worn as a badge of honor, a symbol of their ultimate surrender to God's will. The internal conflict must have been seismic, a war waged in the silent chambers of each follower's heart. But the psychological architecture of control was already firmly in place. To question the doctrine was to question the prophet. To question the prophet was to question God himself. Doubt was a sign of spiritual weakness, of being possessed by a religious spirit. Public confessions and intense group pressure were wielded like instruments to silence any dissent. Women who hesitated were shamed, accused of selfishness and pride, of withholding a gift that could save a man's soul from eternal damnation. This was the point of no return. By embracing flirty fishing, the followers were not just breaking a societal taboo, they were severing their own internal moral compass, replacing it entirely with Berg's voice. They were now bound together by a shared, transgressive secret, a practice that made them utterly alien to the outside world and completely dependent on the group for their identity and sense of worth. But this was only the first layer of this dark revelation. Flirty fishing was not just about recruiting new members. It was a test of absolute power. It proved that Berg could command his followers to do anything, to sacrifice not just their possessions or their time, but the very essence of their personal autonomy and bodily integrity. And once that final boundary was broken, the door was open to a far deeper, more insidious form of exploitation, one that would soon turn its gaze inward upon the most vulnerable members of the family, their own children. Here begins the part of this story that is the most difficult to tell and the most necessary to understand. The ideological poison that seeped into the family through flirty fishing did not remain an external tool. Like a contagion, it mutated, turning its predatory gaze inward. If the bodies of women could be used as instruments for a holy cause, Berg's twisted logic dictated that all bodies and all forms of love could be redefined by his will. The next series of Mo letters descended upon the communes like a shroud, introducing a doctrine he called the law of love. It was a perversion of a biblical concept, warped into a mandate for absolute sexual license within the community. All jealousy, all possessiveness, and all monogamous bonds were condemned as selfish, satanic vestiges of the system. Love in its purest form was to be shared freely without reservation or boundary. And in David Berg's New World Order, this law did not distinguish between adult and child.
The concept of childhood innocence was systematically dismantled. Through his writings, often accompanied by disturbing childlike illustrations, Berg argued that children were not the asexual beings society pretended they were. He claimed they were naturally sexual, and that to deny this was to inflict a cruel and unnatural repression upon them. This was not a subtle suggestion. It was a divine revelation. Parents were instructed to see their children not as wards to be protected, but as fellow disciples on the path to spiritual freedom. The very notion of parental authority was erased and replaced by communal authority, with Berg at its apex. In the cramped, chaotic communes, where privacy was a forgotten luxury, these teachings became a living nightmare. Beds were shared, rooms were communal, and the lines between adult and child interactions blurred into non-existence. Children were taught that physical affection from any adult was a form of God's love.
They were taught that to refuse was to be selfish, to have a bad spirit. This was not random, opportunistic abuse. It was a structured, ideologically driven system of grooming embedded in the very fabric of their daily education and spiritual life. The psychological cage was perfect. Children, born into this world, had no external frame of reference. This was their normal. The adults around them, their own parents included, were reinforcing the same message. Submission is holiness, touch is ministry, and your body is not your own. Imagine the silent terror of a parent watching this unfold. They were trapped. To protect their child, to enforce a boundary, was to commit a spiritual crime. It was to act out of possessiveness. They would be subjected to public shaming, intense group pressure, and the threat of being cast out, losing not just one child, but all of them to the family. Their parental instinct was reframed as a demonic influence.
Their love was redefined as a selfish obstacle to God's plan. So many remained silent, their hearts breaking in a prison of enforced complicity. This escalation solidified the family as a world unto itself, a hermetically sealed society, operating under a moral code that was a perfect inversion of the one outside. Abuse was not only permissible, it was righteous. The violation of a child was not a sin, it was an act of liberation. A generation of children was now being raised in this ideological incubator, their minds and bodies being shaped by a doctrine that equated damage with devotion. They were the ultimate sacrifice on the altar of their prophet's power. But what happens when that generation grows up? What becomes of a soul forged in such a fire, when the world they were taught was holy is revealed to be a landscape of profound and systematic abuse? Here, the story enters its longest and darkest shadow. For those who managed to escape, the world outside was not a sanctuary, it was an alien planet. They emerged, blinking in the harsh light of a reality they had been taught was evil, a system of demonic corruption. They carried no maps for this new terrain, no compass for its moral landscape. Many lacked the most basic documents of existence: birth certificates, social security numbers, school records. They were ghosts in the official world, fluent in a complex language of scripture and submission, but utterly illiterate in the simple grammar of a free life. Every mundane task, opening a bank account, applying for a job without a verifiable history, even navigating a grocery store, was a monumental challenge, a constant, humiliating reminder of their profound otherness. But the practical void was nothing compared to the psychological abyss. The very foundation of their identity had not just crumbled. It had been revealed as a meticulously constructed lie. The love they received was grooming, the spiritual guidance, a manual for manipulation. The people they trusted most, parents, leaders, God Himself, were the architects of their pain. This is a betrayal so total, so fundamental, that the mind fractures under its weight. The result is a deep and enduring trauma, often diagnosed as complex PTSD, a wound inflicted not by a single event, but by years of sustained captivity. Survivors speak of a constant internal war, a battle against the echoes of indoctrination, that whisper of guilt, sin, and worthlessness. The voice of the prophet, internalized since birth, becomes a relentless inner critic. They struggle to form healthy relationships because the template for intimacy they were given was rooted in exploitation and the erasure of consent. How do you learn to trust when the very concept was weaponized against you? How do you set a personal boundary when you were taught that having one was a spiritual crime? The loneliness is profound, an isolation that persists even when surrounded by people, because their life experience is a language no one else speaks. As the world changed and public scrutiny grew, the Family International adapted with chilling efficiency. Was a chameleon, shedding its old skin to survive. The name was changed. The most explicit doctrines, including flirty fishing and the sexualization of children, were officially renounced in the late 1980s and 90s. The organization released carefully worded statements of regret for past mistakes. But for the survivors, this was not accountability. It was a sophisticated form of institutional gaslighting. Their history was being rewritten, their trauma sanitized and dismissed as the excesses of a bygone era. The institution that broke them was now positioning itself as healed, leaving them alone with their unacknowledged wounds. This public relations campaign was a second violation, an attempt to silence their truth forever. This modern consequence is perhaps the most insidious. The abuse is buried under layers of corporate rebranding and plausible deniability. Justice remains a distant, almost impossible dream. David Berg died in 1994, taking his ultimate authority to the grave. Legal systems struggle to penetrate the walls of a global, quasi-religious organization. Statutes of limitation have expired. Evidence, if it ever existed, was often destroyed or scattered across continents. And how do you prosecute a crime when the victims themselves were taught to call it salvation? For thousands of second and third generation members, the legacy is not a memory, but a living inheritance of dysfunction, a quiet and persistent haunting they must carry into the future, a shadow passed from one generation to the next. Consider the story of one such child, born into the family in the late 1970s. We'll call her Alara. For Alara, there was no before. The commune was not a place she joined, it was the entire architecture of her reality, a world painted in the stark colors of salvation and damnation. Her first memories were not of a stable home, but of a constantly shifting landscape of faces and countries, a nomadic existence dictated by the whims of leadership. Her world was one of crowded rooms, shared beds, and the complete absence of privacy. Her education came from the Mo letters, her morality from the doctrine of absolute surrender. She learned to read from texts that told her the outside world, the system, was a corrupt and dying place, and that her purpose was to be a soldier in God's end-time army, a vessel for His will. She was taught that her body was not her own, but a tool for God's work, an instrument for ministry. This was not presented as a violation, but as a sacred privilege. The lines between affection, duty, and exploitation were not just blurred. They were systematically erased by a theology that sanctified abuse. A hug from an elder was a blessing. Sharing her bed was a spiritual requirement, an act of submission to God's chosen leaders. The guilt was not in the act, but in the hesitation. To question was to betray God Himself, to harbor a rebellious spirit that could cost her her soul. Ilara lived in a state of perpetual performance, smiling for the elders, reciting the scriptures, and burying the cold knot of confusion that grew in her stomach. She loved her family, the only family she had ever known, but her love was entangled with a deep, unspoken fear, the fear of displeasing the authority that held their fragile world together. When she finally left, in her late teens, it wasn't a triumphant liberation. It was an amputation. The world she entered was utterly alien, a cacophony of stimuli she was taught to fear. She didn't know how to open a bank account, how to apply for a job, or how to navigate a conversation that wasn't centered on Scripture. Every simple choice, from what to eat to what to wear, was overwhelming, a terrifying exercise in a freedom she had never been prepared for. The void left by the cult's rigid structure was filled with crippling anxiety and a profound sense of dislocation. For years, she battled the echoes of Berg's voice in her head, a relentless internal critic, judging her every move, her every thought. Her trauma wasn't a single event to be overcome, but a complex web of indoctrination that had shaped her very identity, her understanding of love, and her sense of self-worth. Ilara's story is not an outlier. It is the quiet, agonizing anthem of a generation raised in the shadow of a prophet, fighting to reclaim a self they were never allowed to have. Piecing together an identity from the ruins of a faith that promised them everything and took it all. The history of the Family International is not merely the chronicle of a failed utopia or the biography of a corrupt prophet. It is a stark and uncomfortable mirror held up to the human condition itself, reflecting our deepest vulnerabilities, the craving for community, the search for absolute truth, and the profound fear of being alone in a chaotic, seemingly indifferent universe. David Berg did not create these fundamental human needs. He simply and masterfully architected a cage around them, forging the bars from Scripture and locking the door with the promise of ultimate salvation. This cage was not built overnight with overt force, but meticulously assembled, piece by piece, in the minds of his followers. It was a slow, insidious process of replacing external reality with an internal, hermetically sealed worldview, where doubt was a sin and critical thought was a betrayal. The group's greatest tragedy is not just the catalog of abuses it inflicted, but the way it systematically weaponized the very concept of love, twisting it from a source of unconditional support into a tool of coercion and control. Within the commune walls, love was not a gift, but a currency, earned through obedience and withdrawn as punishment. This transformed the most sacred human bonds into a transactional marketplace of loyalty, forcing members to police one another, to report dissent, and even to sacrifice their own children's well-being on the altar of the group's ideology. It taught that submission was devotion, that exploitation was a form of spiritual liberation, and that the silencing of one's own conscience was the ultimate act of faith. This is the enduring, insidious legacy of such movements. They don't just break bodies, they dismantle the very framework of the self. They offer an escape from the terrifying burden of freedom, the anxiety of choice, the weight of personal responsibility, and replace it with the comforting certainty of a pre-written script. Every question has an answer. Every action has a divine purpose, and every sacrifice is justified. The ultimate moral question this story leaves us with is not about the evil of one man, but about the fragility of the human spirit in the face of absolute certainty. It forces us to confront the razor-thin line that separates faith from subjugation, community from conformity, and devotion from delusion. How much of ourselves are we willing to sacrifice for a sense of purpose? And when the walls of that purpose are built on the suffering of the vulnerable, when do we find the courage to recognize the prison for what it is and tear it down? The survivors of the Family International, fighting every day to reclaim their names, their minds, and their futures, offer the only true answer. Their journey is not just a struggle against trauma. It is an act of profound rebellion, a testament to the resilience of a self that was declared worthless, but refused to be extinguished. The most sacred journey, we learn from them, is not the one towards a promised paradise, but the painstaking, painful, and profoundly human struggle back to oneself. Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration. If you believe these stories need to be told, consider subscribing to our channel for more.